Thank you. Good evening. Welcome to the 329th meeting of the Economic Club of Chicago. I'll begin with a few announcements about our upcoming programs. Our 82nd annual dinner meeting will be held on Monday, April 12th at the Palmer House Hilton Hotel. Our guest speaker will be Indra K. Nui, Chairman and CEO of PepsiCo. We are delighted to announce a Forum Luncheon Sports Series for April to include two premier programs with several of the most prominent Chicago sports figures of today. On Wednesday, April 7th, new Chicago Cubs Chairman Tom Ricketts will address the Economic Club Forum. And additionally, Rocky Wirtz and John McDonough from the Chicago Blackhawks have agreed to address the club at our luncheon on Monday, April 19th. Announcements will be sent to you in advance and can also be viewed on the club's website. It has become customary on the third dinner meeting of the year to recognize the Chicago Counselor Corps, which is a prominent part of our membership that represents corners of the world. We have 9 countries represented by their consul generals here with us tonight. These active members of the club fulfill an important mission to their countries and to Chicago by developing strong economic, social, intellectual, and cultural links. We salute your dedication and collaboration. The listing of those in attendance tonight is in the front of your program book. Now I'd like to ask the Counselor Corps members to stand and be recognized. Thank you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the speakers table. As I call their names, I'll ask each to stand and remain standing until the introductions have been completed. Please hold your applause until we have all been introduced. Beginning at my far left, Dean I. Chung, Managing Director, Insight Out Strategy Advisors. Robert S. Murley, Chairman of Investment Banking, America's Credit Suisse. Elizabeth Glassman, President and CEO, the Terra Foundation for American Art. Lester H. McKeever, Managing Principal, Washington, Pittman and McKeever. David D. Hiller, President and CEO, McCormick Foundation. Ann Roosevelt, Vice President for Global Corporate Citizenship, the Boeing Company. Charles L. Evans, President and CEO, Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, and Director of the club. The Honorable Patricia Maza Pittsford, Consul General of El Salvador and the Dean of the Counselor Corps. Sophia Siskel, President and CEO, Chicago Botanic Garden. Jack M. Greenberg, Chairman, the Western Union Company. Jay Jordan, Chairman and CEO, Jordan Industries. Ned Janata, Chairman, William Blair & Company, LLC, and past Chairman of the club. Andy McKenna, Chairman, McDonald's Corporation and Schwartz Supply Source, and past Chairman of the club. And now to my far right, John C. Leahy, Chairman, Solomon, Corwell & Booth. Carrie J. Heitman, Executive Vice President and Chief Legal Officer, NiSource. Dean M. Harrison, President and CEO, Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Thomas Maher, Managing Director, Grosvenor Capital Management LP, and Director of the club. Phyllis M. Lockett, President and CEO, Renaissance Schools Fund. Vern G. Istock, Retired Chairman and President, Bank One Corporation. Jack F. Sanders, Special Policy Advisor and Retired Chairman of the Board, Member of the Executive Committee, CME Group, Inc. Donna Fret Zarcone, President and CEO, DF Zarcone & Associates, LLC, and Treasurer of the club. David B. Spear, Chairman and CEO, Illinois Tool Works, and Director of the club. Miles D. White, Chairman and CEO, Abbott, and past Chairman of the club. And now, a round of applause for this distinguished group. We will now take a 10-minute break before we welcome our guest speakers. I urge you to be brief and adhere to the 10-minute time frame. Thank you.
It is. I thought it was interesting about editorial a lot of it is a city thing. The last thing they had is they had to go around Denver. I was asking these guys if they're allowed to be at the same part of the table. How are you? Squeeze it up there, right?
So can I get through here? Hello, young man. Sweet apple bottle passing around.
But you've got these turned on, right? Yeah, I mean, did you?
We have everybody seated, please. Well, welcome back. Tonight, we welcome two distinguished Chicago business leaders. First, William Osborn is the quintessential Chicago businessman. He serves as a director of Caterpillar Inc., Tribune Company, and Abbott Laboratories, all headquartered in Illinois. He is also the quintessential Chicago philanthropist, serving as a member of the Board of Trustees of the Museum of Science Industry, a director of the Terra Foundation, chairman of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra Association, and board chair of Northwestern University, where he received his undergraduate degree and an MBA. In addition to those already mentioned, he serves on the board of 8 other Chicago area nonprofits, ranging from the Chicago Urban League to the Lyric Opera to our own Economic Club of Chicago. Did I mention that Bill is retired? At the end of 2009, he left Chicago-based Northern Trust Company after serving in a variety of leadership roles over 39 years, including the role of chairman from 1995 until his retirement. Under his leadership, Northern grew exponentially, making strategic acquisitions and becoming a global leader in asset management. During his 14-year tenure as the bank's chairman, the stock rose 540% compared to the S&P 500's gain of only 160%. Over that same time, the company's market cap grew over 5-fold, from $2.25 billion to over $12.5 billion. But Bill always does the right thing, which includes always putting his people and customers first. Bill's been very much of a hands-on leader. Also, he's been a champion for diversity. To that end, one of his lasting legacies at Northern was the establishment of the Dreammakers Conference, whose mission was to cultivate African American wealth building from around the country, as well as Vision Keepers, which is a conference that is similarly aimed at women's entrepreneurs. When Bill is not serving others, he spends time with his wife Kathy, another Northwestern grad, their 2 children, and 3 grandchildren. Please help me welcome a capitalist with a conscience, venerated civic leader, and newly crowned king of the Northwestern Wildcats, Bill Osborn.
Thank you, John. I must tell you, when John called and asked if I would speak to this august group, I was a little taken back, and I said, I'm an old retired guy, you don't want me here. And then I said, but it would be interesting if Ed Liddy and I got here together. So I actually think in the Q&A it'll be fun. And hopefully, and what we want to do tonight is to maybe impart a little bit of our view of what happened that's impacted this country and all of the institutions really around the world in a major way. And even as you look forward, maybe some of the ways to get out of the problems that exist today. And what we're going to do, and is I'm going to spend a few minutes, and I want to talk about 2 things. Debt. As a banker, I know a little bit about debt, but in a larger context. And the other thing I want to talk about is liquidity. And any of you in the business sector will understand the importance of those two. Ed's going to talk a little bit about the areas that he understands well, including that great time, I think he was at AIG, and then we're going to go through some Q&A, and hopefully we can liven things up. And in my comments I'm going to make here, I want to be a little provocative, because you don't want me to just be here and kind of rattle off some things that you already know, but some things that maybe didn't go well or we should think about differently. So I'm going to throw you some statistics at the beginning, and I'm going to try to pull that together. If you go back to the beginning of the problems, you really have to go back to really the end of 2000, which was the tech bubble. Remember Y2K? Everybody remembers Y2K, and everybody had to prepare for that. And post that, the economy really suffered, and interest rates were lowered rather dramatically in 01 and 02 to 1% Fed funds rate. And that began a period of time of very rapid growth, as all of you know, and it took off through really the summer of 07. And to give you an idea on those statistics, the total amount of aggregate debt in this country, this is not just federal debt, this is debt from consumers, mortgages, mortgage-backed securities, asset-backed securities, corporate bonds, every kind of debt was in this country at that time was $25 trillion. And in the course of 2000 to 2007, that aggregate debt number doubled. It went up to $50 trillion. And in fact, the debt, the compound growth of debt was double the rate of growth of GDP during that period. If you go back to, again, to look at end of 2000, debt to GDP was about 250%. Today, it's 350%. And it gives you an idea of the extreme amount of leverage that was created. But now I'm going to give you what's underneath those numbers, which I think is even more important. A lot of what happened was mortgage-backed securities, asset-backed securities, agency, all that stuff, that grew from $5.8 trillion to $12.3 trillion. You know, and remember, a trillion is 1,000 billion, okay? So just to give everybody the kind of context of this, mortgages went from 4.8 trillion to 10.6 trillion. You saw, in fact, during this period, the federal government debt grew rather modestly from 3.4 trillion to 5.8 trillion. So the fact of the matter is, we were going debt crazy in this country. And it was everyone out there buying a house. Money was too cheap. You know, and I hate to say that, because one will argue right today with interest rates where they are, is it too cheap? And are we going to create the same kind of asset bubble that we did? But those are real issues for us. You know, the subprime market started. I'm going to rattle off some things. You know, you saw the subprime market really take off and create a lot of this paper that got securitized. And you saw the bankers make money, the investment bankers. Remember Glass-Steagall, when it separated that to it? In '99 it came back, and so everybody could do everything, and all of a sudden you had these deals, and now everything was pushed out there. Investors were looking for higher yield. All these securities were put together. The securitization market took off. Even the creation, and I still don't get this one, on some financial institutions created what are called SIVs, structured investment vehicles, and how they had those off-balance sheet structures on their, you know, in their institutions, and this was post-Enron. And wasn't Enron supposed to do away with that? I never did understand how these things could really come together. You had regulators focused post 9/11 primarily on anti-money laundering. It was really where they wanted to spend time. They weren't looking at these risk issues out there. Sorry, Karen. You know, my friends at the Fed, I told them I was going to have to. You saw the creation of derivatives. All these derivatives, all these credit default swaps, and I know Ed will probably talk about them in a minute. And you really think about how those were handled. None were, everything's off the exchanges. Why? And so if those were settled, would we be in a different kind of environment as we went on there? The unbelievable growth of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the leverage that they had and how that was really fostered by our government in Washington and those that are criticizing everything today. It's an unbelievable period. And where are we today? We're trying to unwind from that. Since the end of '07, actually our debt levels are up only modestly, about 52 trillion, but the government piece of that is what's taken hold. So that's shifted over, has taken away all the write-offs that have had to take place. The system's written off about 1.7 trillion. It's a lot of money. Banking industry. Estimates still are that by 2013, that 1.7 it will be anywhere from 2.2 trillion to 4 trillion. 25% of all the mortgages in this country today are underwater. So we've got in this country a real tough issue, and that is debt. And we've got to create a society that does not increase debt, that decreases debt, and candidly have GDP growth go up and get this thing in balance in the future. It's a big issue. It's one that we all have to be party to doing that and to making it work. Second issue I wanted to raise, and it's one as you get into the understanding of what causes fundamental problems is liquidity. And any of you that have run businesses and did it from starting at the end of '07 through '08 and towards the fall of '08 know what I'm talking about. The markets froze up during this period. Credit spreads widened dramatically. They had been, poor John Canning's not here tonight, but people used to give him money, and he borrowed at ridiculously low spreads and could make money in any kind of leverage transaction. But all of a sudden, those spreads widened, and it shut off the private equity business for a period of time. It's coming back now, and I know Jay obviously did well during that period. But the problem we have is that this environment that's been there and this liquidity issue became really an important challenge. And the financial system is so intricately tied together that as soon as you start taking and playing around with one, it impacts others. And I can remember vividly talking about, do we lend other major institutions money during some very critical periods? And you found those that were in good shape had lots of liquidity coming in, but boy, you didn't want to be caught in the daisy chain where all of a sudden you were lending money back out to an institution and they failed. So what happened? The Fed had to go in as a lender of last resort and basically put a floor under everybody. And it's a tragic system that we saw develop, and one we have to unwind in a whole different way. But it has caused this focus on liquidity, which I think is going to be very important. The rating agencies are focused on it, and candidly, all management and boards are focused on it right now. You saw Warren Buffett. I don't know if any of you watched him on Monday, and he talked about buying Burlington Northern. And they asked him, why did you raise more money? He wanted to keep $20 billion of liquidity, if any of you listened to him. He wanted $20 billion in his back pocket because he didn't want to ever be caught, with an empty billfold. He wanted to be able to take advantage of things. So I think there are a lot of lessons that we are learning and there are a lot of ways through this, but we really, in my view, we're kind of in a slow period out of this. So I look forward with Ed answering your questions, and I might add, Ed Liddy is one of the finest human beings for what he did for this country and stepping in and with AIG, but also a great executive.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's great. Our second speaker tonight, Edward Liddy, has worked as a partner at the private equity firm of Clayton, Dublier, and Rice since 2008. In addition to serving as a director of 3M, he also serves on the boards of Northwestern University and the Museum of Science and Industry with Bill. He previously served on the boards of the Boeing Company and Goldman Sachs. And finally, he is a life trustee and former national chairman of the Boys and Girls Club of America. I think it's safe to say, like Bill, Ed Liddy is one of the hardest working retired men I know, and I haven't even gotten to the good part. In the fall of 2008, Ed was enjoying his long-awaited retirement, having stepped down from his post as chairman of Allstate Insurance. He joined the company in 1994 and certainly made an indelible mark. During his tenure, he spearheaded Allstate's IPO and its eventual spinoff from Sears. He also transformed this personal insurer into the colossal giant it is today. By the time he turned in his company ID card, Ed was happy to be able to spend more time with his wife, Marcia, and 3 children and 5 grandchildren. Then the subprime mortgage crisis hit a fever pitch in September 2008 with unprecedented financial casualties that seemed to multiply by the day. Insurer American International Group, AIG, was collapsing under the pressure of mounting losses from bad mortgage bets and having insured credit default swaps. With this global giant facing a serious liquidity crisis, the government was forced to execute the largest public bailout of a private company in United States history. In the midst of this catastrophic financial environment, the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury called Ed with a request. Would he serve his country as interim chairman and chief executive officer of AIG? Ed once said, "In the midst of a crisis, you can be a critic or get in the game." Ed decided to play ball. In September of 2008, he was appointed CEO of AIG, the 3rd man to hold the title in as many months. And as Bill alluded to, it's, as they say, no good deed goes unpunished. Ed soon found himself at the center of a contentious national battle related to a bonus schedule that was in place before he joined AIG. He was a visible but illogical target because as CEO of AIG, Ed was paid only $1 a year. Undaunted by misdirected public criticism, he tirelessly pursued a strategy to sell off assets, pay back the billions of bailout dollars, and shrink AIG into a much smaller, more sustainable company. Although he spent a little less than a year at the helm of AIG during this frenzied time, he stabilized the company and instituted a plan to repay American taxpayers. On his last day on the job, AIG reported its first profitable results in 7 quarters, $1.8 billion. It's unfortunate the Olympics are over, because if anyone deserves a medal, it's Ed. His country called for help. He accepted an incredibly difficult assignment and undertook the job with skill and dignity, and he's here with us tonight to share his lessons of this extraordinary time. Ed holds a BA from Catholic University and an MBA from George Washington University. Please help me welcome respected business leader and patriot, Edward Liddy.
Thank you, John, for those kind words, and Bill, you also. Let me set the record straight. I did work for $1 a year, but I got paid 4 cents every 2 weeks. Now, never one to miss an opportunity to have some fun. I chose to take the 4 cents as a check. So I have about 22 checks. And one of these days on eBay, you'll see me auction off a few of those checks. I'll also tell you that 4 cents was the gross amount. So as you know, in our great country, one must pay federal taxes, state taxes, city taxes, Medicare, Social Security, and a few other things. And at AIG, each of those fields required a minimum $1 deduction. So if you can do the math with me, you start out with a gross of 4 cents, then you have $5 worth of deductions. I had to pay $4.96 to get the 4 cents. It's a great country. Listen, one good thing about being with you tonight is Bill and I are going to chat about reflections on the financial crisis. It's nice to be in a position where enough time has passed and enough progress has been made that we can talk about reflections. Because there was a time 18 months ago, roughly in September of 2008, when, like so many of you, I was not certain where we were going. And I do think we were very close to a precipice, which if we and the world had fallen off of, things would be a lot different than they are today. So I thought I'd start with 7 thoughts, and then we can go over more of them after when Bill and I are entertaining questions and answers. My first thought, and I wish Bill and I had compared notes because we have a lot of the same things to say. But my first thought is, you'll recall 15, 20 years ago when Bill Clinton was running against George Bush, and somebody came out with that famous statement about, "It's the economy, stupid," and really captured in a very few words the essence of what was going on. Well, as I reflect upon the financial crisis, I would change one word. It's the liquidity, stupid. It's amazing to me how many people don't understand how important liquidity is. Liquidity to a financial system, either the United States or worldwide, is based on trust and confidence. And when those things erode, liquidity dries up very quickly. And what happened to us, to the world, in the fall of 2008 was an enormous collapse of the liquidity system. So when you went to your money market account, a source of perfect security, and you wanted to take out $1 that you had put in some cases you were offered 97 cents on the dollar. That is a recipe for disaster and panic. It is about liquidity, and if the country and the financial system and the people that impact the financial system can learn one thing from this lesson, it's understand your liquidity and concentrate on it, and never, never do anything to get caught short. Second, was the government intervention necessary in the financial system? In general, I am not big on government intervention because I think it is a fairly slippery slope, which once started is very, very difficult to exit from. But having said that, I don't know that it makes much sense to stick with a dogma and have the world around you collapse. So I do think that the intervention on the part of the government was an appropriate course of action. In this crisis, there was no playbook. There was nothing for Chairman Bernanke or Secretary of Treasury U.S. Paulson. You don't reach up and grab the book and say, what happened? What do you do when liquidity dries up? Go to Chapter 8 and it'll give you the answer. And I think on balance, when you look back at what they did, it was really quite remarkable. The bank TARP program seems to me to be in pretty good shape. Most of the money's been repaid with appropriate interest and dividends. AIG is following a playbook which I've left them, and they're beginning to pay back TARP dollars. So I do think if the government had not intervened then, I think our current situation would be substantially worse. Third reflection, was government intervention in AIG really necessary? And I wasn't there at the birthing of this decision, but I had plenty of time to examine it on its face and decide whether I agreed with it or not. And I do think that it was important that the government step in and rescue AIG. And just to refresh your memory, on September 7th, the government seized Fannie and Freddie. Now, to many people, that wasn't much of an event because they thought they were government entities already, because they acted and behaved like a government entity. But those two organizations were seized. And then on September 15th, Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. On September 16th, Merrill Lynch was forced or ran into the waiting arms of B of A. On September 17th, AIG was extended an $80 billion emergency loan from the Federal Reserve. Also on September 17th, the Reserve Fund broke the buck, and you could not get out of your money market fund $1 for every dollar that you put in it. On that day, $220 billion was redeemed from money market funds, about 6 to 7% of the amount outstanding, which is a stunning number. People were running for their currency, for their liquidity. They were prepared to put it in their closets or their mattresses, rather than have it in financial institutions that they weren't sure they'd be able to access. You know, I am not a fan of too big to fail, but in the financial world, Bill said it well, everything is so interconnected, and I'm not sure that regulators and government, and I'm not sure business people really understood the sheer size and magnitude of AIG. So when Lehman Brothers failed, it had about $700 billion in assets. AIG's balance sheet was $1.1 trillion. You know, by comparison, Enron, the nasty boy of many years ago, had about $66 billion. So AIG was, you know, do the math, 17 or 18 times the size of Enron. It had $1.9 trillion in face value of insurance policies outstanding around the world, primarily life insurance policies. It had $3 trillion of credit default swaps. I'm not even sure I knew what a credit default swap was. I mean, I knew it tangentially, but I didn't know it nearly as well as I know it now. But $3 trillion, as Bill said, you know, $3 trillion, that's 9 zeros preceded by a 3. I mean, it's just an absolutely staggering number. So my sense is that if AIG, given its size and given that litany of things that had happened before it, if it had failed, I think it would have created a fear and uncertainty near panic that would have been very difficult for us to get over. Fourth reflection, sunshine and transparency are great disinfectants in politics and in finance. As Bill said, the level of complexity that now exists in the financial marketplace, with instruments that are necessary, you must be able to hedge things, and some synthetic investments are very important. But the lack of transparency, the lack of standardization, the lack of putting them on an exchange, I think really made a bad situation very much worse. So I'm a firm believer in the continued drive for transparency and sunshine in today's ever complex world. Fifth, the intersection of government and business is a tough one. And it's not because there are red light cameras. It's because the currency that the organizations use is entirely different and is somewhat irreconcilable. You know, in the business world, it is about market share and return on equity and taking care of your customers and motivating your employees. In politics, to simplify, it's about incredibly macro issues, incredibly micro issues, or votes. It's very hard to reconcile those two currencies. So when the two mix in as volatile a way as they mixed in the fourth quarter of 2008, it usually is a recipe for disaster. Sixth, we sometimes skip over the personal toll that this whole thing has taken. And I will tell you, at AIG, there were 116,000 employees. And those employees had about as much to do with the collapse of AIG as each and every one of you in this room. They're good people. They came to work every Monday morning ready to fight hard, ready to do their jobs. And one Tuesday morning they came in and their world was absolutely gone because of the way the pay systems were constructed, where much of your comp was tied to the price of AIG stock. People who had been there 30 years and were anticipating a comfortable retirement were wiped out. And they were wiped out without the benefit of having enough time to ever recover from it. So if you want to think about an ultimate leadership challenge or management challenge, think about trying to motivate 116,000 people who suddenly have their lives completely uprooted. And you can take that one step further, and you know, this has been a great dinner and it is a great place, but you think about the 1 in 10 Americans out there that don't have a job. That's a stated number. Actual number is probably closer to 1 in 7. So sometimes we look at the numbers, you know, the AIG bailout, $182 billion, but just stop for a minute and think about the incredible personal toll that this whole financial crisis has taken on people, because it's easy for us to lose sight of it. Last thing I would say is, despite all of those reflections, this is a great country. It's unlike any other country in the world, and the American system of capitalism, in my judgment, has been the world's engine of growth for the last 110 years. It's not perfect, and we don't get everything right, but we do have a unique ability when we get it wrong to throw it up in each other's face and beat it up and do something about it. And we ought not to lose sight of that. I mean, if anybody can righting the ship, it is probably this country. We need to be careful because the American system of capitalism, I think, really has driven the world's growth, as I said, over the last roughly century or so. And it probably needs to be tweaked, and we need some changes to it, but we should be very vigilant, because as we make changes to it, what we don't want to do is kill the goose that laid the golden egg. It's easy to look at this little change and this little change, and each one looks very simple and not particularly impactful, but then all of a sudden you look at them in total and you say, yikes, what have I done? It's important when you start making changes to things in the heat of battle that you be reflective and you be patient, lest you really unleash something that changes what you have. Thanks. Sorry, John.
I think you guys are, I think Ed, can you?
Oh, this is much better.
Thanks so much for those great remarks. I think maybe we'll start with where you ended. You talked about our extraordinary American capitalist system. And Warren Buffett's talked a lot about that also, very eloquently, about how we have a way to solve our problems in this country. So what I want to start with is, where do you think we are in the economic recovery? And how right is Warren in his analysis of we always find a way to come out of these cycles? Start with you, Bill.
Well, I believe that we've kind of been hit bottom and we're kind of moving back up in a positive way. But the issue that I raised, and I think this debt overhang that we have, and this deleveraging that's going on, is going to make this a rather much slower recovery than where we may have thought in the past, that where we get a big bounce back after a situation that we faced this time. So I'm more cautious, John, about this. I do believe we will get through this, but I think it's going to be long and it's going to be tough. And we know that Ed mentioned, and we all know about the unemployment issues, and I think that's going to make it tougher. And plus, you go around the world. I didn't raise this issue, but UK is in a terrible situation. It's got terrible debt. We know what's happened in Greece. Spain is teetering. Iceland went bankrupt. You can kind of walk around, and other than in parts of Asia, but Japan's not in great shape. Tremendous amount of debt. So other than China and India, in terms of areas that have some positive activity, it's relatively challenging. It doesn't mean that businesses won't do better and get through this, but I think it's going to be a more muted type of recovery.
What signs should we look for as business people that we're starting to see a real solid recovery?
Well, I think you'll start to see the order flow. You'll see employment come back. But I think there's a real trickiness right now with interest rates. I'd let Charlie can talk about this a little bit. But the fact of the matter is, I think rates will have to come up at some point, and I don't think that'll be bad. There's a lot of debate about that. I would be one that would argue that should be taken off the table, and the rate should come up a little bit sooner, and give a little flexibility. There are a lot of savers out there that are not getting anything on their money right now. That's the other side of it. But I think you'll see it in gradually unemployment will come back, and you'll see the business activity. It's already picking up, but it's just not as robust as you might like.
In the Berkshire annual report that came out this weekend, Warren Buffett talks about the housing market coming back over the next 12 to 18 months. How important is the housing market to this ultimate economic recovery?
I'm enjoying what you have to say.
We're supposed to share.
I'll take a crack at it. I love Warren Buffett. I think he's a great investor, and he's certainly a good read. I think he may be optimistic on this. If you start where Bill was, this is the highest unemployment rate we've had for a very long period of time. if I remember the numbers correctly, you need about 3% GDP growth just to absorb new people coming into the labor force. So that implies you need something above that in order to absorb that unemployment rate and drive it down. It's hard to imagine with world economies where they are and with the U.S. consumer still very cautious that you can get the 5-6% growth rates to drive unemployment down at a very rapid rate. So people just aren't going to spend money. They aren't going to invest in housing if they don't have some comfort that they're going to have a job. I think there are real estate is the ultimate local game. And there are clearly pockets around the United States where real estate will come back very strong. But I think there's a lot of places. They happen to be the places where a lot of people live. They happen to be the places that have sand or sun. And I think it's going to be a much slower recovery in some of those places than those that are more optimistic would seem to think.
So if you were advising President Obama today, what would be the 2 or 3 ideas that you would feel would be necessary to really jumpstart and make this recovery more robust?
I would go after 3 things. I would go after jobs, jobs, and jobs. I do think things like revamping healthcare are important, but I think you need to put it in some sort of an historical perspective. We need to create jobs in this country, and I'm not sure the federal government can do that except through its tax policies. We need to get people back to work. And if we could focus on that, perhaps it would mean that the debt and the deficit that Bill talked about before wouldn't grow. I mean, you know, I like to keep things simple. Hopefully they're not wrong when I keep them simple, but the government's like a family. You cannot live beyond your means, and we seem to have done that for so long that the day of reckoning is here. If we could pull back, do less in terms of new programs, concentrate on jobs, don't let that deficit get any larger, and pay down debt, we would be making a real statement and creating a better lives for our children and our grandchildren.
Yeah. John, and I think that's what the public has been saying too, in their reaction to a lot of the initiatives that are going on. It's about the economy and jobs, and I think the focus has to be there. And you know, and I didn't talk about this, but you know, the other issue that we have that's hanging out there is all this, and we know this in the state of Illinois, the state finances, Illinois, you go to California, all around, the pension problems and all, you know, these are all major issues, and actually they're gonna make it a challenge for everyone to come through this unless we focus on it. And focusing on that means that you gotta not be thinking about all these other issues out there, I think, quite as much as they do now in Washington.
Okay, you know, a lot of the questions from the Questions Committee revolved around this issue of balancing the stimulating the economy and the controlling of the deficit. So can you sort of give your thoughts about how you get that just right?
I think you get it right with great difficulty. You know, I don't know that the stimulus package that we put in place will ultimately stimulate. I think there's a lot of studies, there's a lot of people who know much more about this than I do. You know, do stimulus packages really in fact drive things, or do they drive such a small segment of the population that it just doesn't make any sense? I would start most of the programs from the other point of view. I would start with, I've got a deficit now of X. I'm just not going to add to that deficit. So what can I cut out? What can I not start that would prevent me from adding to that deficit? I guess, you know, if I had the choice, I don't know that I would have done a stimulus package, or I wouldn't have done it as large, or I might have put it in different places, and I would think long and hard before I would unveil another one.
We were talking a little bit up at the dinner table about the complexities of Washington now and how hard it is to get things accomplished in a positive, constructive way. Do you have thoughts on how we can sort of improve the climate in Washington and be able to move us forward for good decision making? Sorry.
Send Eric there. He'll take care of it all. The political world is a very, you know, Ed saw it firsthand. I mean, and we're seeing it every day. It's a very difficult environment, and we can't get people on the same page right now.
Well, you know, you mentioned Ed's experience. You know, a year ago, Ed, you spoke to the subcommittee of the House Financial Services Committee.
Well, spoke might not be the right word, But I do remember the event, John.
Were you tempted to at times ask some of the questioners, like, well, what was your major?
You know, that was a difficult experience for me for a lot of reasons. Took a fair amount of self-control, not just to take my dollar, throw it on the table, and say, "You guys have all the answers. You do it." You know, there's two parts to Washington. There's what happens behind the scenes, and there's what happens in public view, and they are dramatically different. So, we actually made a fair amount of progress with Congress. They did understand that there was a plan in place. It's a plan with various contingencies and alternatives, and if you look at what's in the paper right now, I mean, the plan we put in place months and months ago was to take this very large asset of AIG public, and if somebody came along and the market's improved and they wanted to buy it for a big price, sell it to them. That's exactly what's happened, and so I think Congress, for the most part, understood that there was a plan, but I think they get wrapped up in the emotionalism of the moment on a specific issue that is just wildfire. And it's unfortunate that that happens. You're never quite sure what the issue is going to be. But in this case, it was $166 million of bonuses that were due people in accordance with contracts that were written a couple of years ago. I'm with Bill. I wish I could throw you out a nice, simple solution as to how to get things moving in Washington. I just don't know what it is. I increasingly think the mood of the country is just throw them all out. You know, Democrats, Republicans, anything, just throw them all out. I mean, how bad can it be if you just start all over again? I'm not sure that's the answer, but that may well be the result that we get.
Do you worry that this environment will discourage business leaders and people who understand economics and understand running a business from getting engaged in government in any kind of a meaningful fashion?
You know, I do, but I'd like to think that people are bigger thinkers than that. You said it well. I've believed it, and I know Bill's believed it all his life. When you have a skill that can help, and the United States of America, our country, is in serious trouble, you really do have two choices. You can be a critic, you can sit in the sidelines and, you know, throw barbs, or you can try to do something. I'd like to think that most people would try to do something, but I do think that, we were talking about this at dinner, I think there's far less business perspective in Washington today than there's ever been. I don't know that's an invitation to people to go down there, and I think most folks will probably think long and hard about it, much more so than perhaps they would have in the past. But think big thoughts and get past that.
I think you also, John, you know, you have the issue today, if you've been in the business sector, you know, when you show up for any kind of hearings, I mean, you're the enemy right there. I mean, so that's a discouraging factor, I think, to a degree, and if they can kind of pull back on that, I think they might be able to get more people to get engaged in that way. That tone has to change.
Well, as we talk about some of the solutions, I know, Ed, you've talked about it, and Bill, you have also, about the size of these giant financial institutions, the complexity, the lack of transparency. As we think about solutions, is the Volcker Rule and sort of getting away from Glass-Steagall the right direction to go or not?
Well, it's a very complicated issue because the financial system is not just a U.S. system, it's a global system, and so the competitive environment is really around the world. And I think once you've created the issue of institutions being able to deal in multiple areas of the financial sector, it's hard to separate that back out again. But the regulators, I think, can be more aggressive in the way they oversee this. I think the capital rules and requirements around lines of business can be made stronger. I think the understanding of risk in the way things like credit default swaps are handled and putting them on the exchanges. I think if you go through each piece of this, you can reconstruct it in a much more rational way that could allow the system to operate better and to be regulated better and the risk to be less.
You know, I would add to that, John, I don't know why a company like AIG, which was a great company, it is a great insurance company, but doesn't make any sense to me that that insurance company would have this thing called the Financial Products Division that would write products that had such a large amount of risk attached to them. And it wasn't, I mean, they were well thought out products. The people that sold them never thought that you could get into the kind of liquidity crunch that hit the U.S. economy and hit the world. And when it did, you know, it was 20 standard deviations away from the norm, not 2 or 3, which is what all the modeling was done on. So I don't know how you would enforce this, but, you know, it just doesn't make any sense to me that a company like AIG, an insurance company, well-run, well-regulated insurance company, would get into something called financial products. That's a world for banks and investment banks. It's not a world for insurance companies. So how you get to the point where someone can adjudicate what's too big, and what it's not necessarily big measured by zeros. It's big measured by the breadth of the enterprise. And when are you too big to be able to self-police and self-enforce? That will be a challenge for whatever regulatory scheme emerges from this crisis.
When Secretary Geithner was here, he talked about the drama and trauma of that time when we were on the precipice, as you talked about. Could you take us back to that and just sort of give us sort of a little bit of those early days and how you were actually dealing with the crisis and working with your boards to help think through how to make sure we didn't fall off the cliff, and how you interacted with government along the way too?
You know, mine was an interesting one. I showed up on a Thursday morning or a Wednesday morning and said to the board, "Hi, I'm your new CEO." It's not exactly the way they write it in the corporate governance books, you know. So starting with that, it was a fairly arduous process. You know, I mentioned before human toll, and I'll just say this for a minute. If you read Hank Paulson's book, he does a good job of fleshing this out. You just can't imagine the pressure, the fact that you thought you were going to work on topics A, B, and C today, and along came topics, you know, Q, F, G, and H. Around every corner was something. There's a young man in this room who now works for Allstate named Matt Winter, who was a beacon of light. I found him down in Houston. I promoted him to a vice chairman. You know, most nights were 4 hours sleep if you were lucky. Now, many of you have a lot more energy than I have, I'm sure, but, you know, you do the 4 hours of sleep for 7 or 8 or 9 months, it just grinds down on you. And there's, as I said, there's no playbook. You don't go to chapter 8, line 7 and say, do this. Every day was an issue that you just didn't expect. And the government intervention, which I said before I thought was the right thing, brings with it a certain requirement to review things with them. So where speed is normally of the essence, and you understand as a CEO, you understand what your ability, your range of actions, your range of freedom is. But when all of a sudden you have the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, you have to build and articulate and get buy-in to the business case. So everything becomes a longer process. Not necessarily a bad process, but it just becomes elongated. So the sheer human toll that it took to get through that, when I look back on it, was interesting. And I'm not sure I really fully understood just how exhausting it was until I was no longer doing it. And you know, you get a chance to recharge your batteries. It was an exciting place to be, to have a window on the world like that. But golly, it was exhausting.
And how much time did you have to travel a lot during that period, or were you focused in New York? How did you?
No, you have to travel. I mean, you have the 116,000 people out there. You have the folks in Houston who want to know, well, what's going to happen to my business? You have regulators in Hong Kong and Singapore who want to grab you by the throat and say, what the heck is going on? Do I need to start worrying about seizing these assets? So you do have to, you know, get out and speak to the regulators in all of the major countries. You have to do some of the normal, I'll call it hand-holding. That's not a very generous word, but you have to make sure that you can paint a picture that there's an end to this for your employees. So you got to run your business, which is incredibly stressed. At the same time as you're trying to figure out, okay, what's the answer? What do you set in motion in order to make sure that the taxpayer gets paid? You have, you know, people, rating agencies. I mean, if you take an $80 billion loan and put it on top of a company that has X billions of dollars of equity, guess who calls you? The rating agencies. And they say, well, you used to be rated this, and now you got $80 billion of debt, and that can't be. And you know, the rating agencies were under their own sense of intense pressure, so it was a thrill a minute.
And Bill, I'm like,
John, I'd add, yeah, you know, remember this started, though, I mean, the match was lit back in September of '08, but it started in July of '07. And this thing was building, and the markets were really sending very, very strong messages all the way along. As risk started to get repriced, it was basically, there was no risk in the system the way it was being worked, for about 4 or 5 years there, and people could borrow. In fact, as I said, people were giving money away. And as soon as those markets started to change, the fixed income markets, and those that have touched that out there, it was very difficult for really 18 months. I mean, starting in July and through the whole next year, and it was, you had different periods of time. You had Bear Stearns, you had different events that flared up. You had WAMU, and you had Countrywide. I mean, we can go through all the different issues here, but then when Lehman hit, it was kind of the match that lit this, and that's when there was such an extreme amount of unsecured debt. My recollection is Lehman had about $150 billion of unsecured debt on all sorts of portfolios around, and that caused a lot of the run that Ed referred to on the money market funds. It caused a lot of institutions that were trying to manage their portfolios. It tore them apart, and that's when all this liquidity challenge started to hit. And thank God, Secretary Paulson and Chairman Bernanke were there to help guide this thing and really move it through, because it was a horrific time. And money was moving around, but it would not land where it was needed because people were scared to death to take the risk of online lending. And the way this was knit together, it was very scary. It was very scary. And there was a lot of communication from the financial institutions to the Fed and to the Treasury. And the Treasury didn't always know exactly what was going on. You'd have to tell them. You have to tell them, hey, the markets are frozen. There's no trading. There's nothing going on here. And in an environment like the world we're in today, you have to have that. And again, I'll remind you, this wasn't just in the U.S. It was in the UK. It was all around the world.
Well, I would, John, sorry, I would just add to that. I do agree with Bill. When I look back on it, you could see many of the signs in 2000, at the end of 2007, were beginning to flash red, bubble, 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 get ready. And I'll tell you, at the time I was the chairman of the Audit and Risk Committee at Goldman Sachs. It was a fascinating job, and we took a position with Goldman that they were generating a 37% return on equity, and they had $70 billion of excess capital. So the question put to them was, well, why don't you have $100 billion of excess capital and have only a 33% return on equity? And when we got to that, we said, well, why don't you have $125 billion of excess capital? And it was really a good thing to do, because they had sufficient excess liquidity and still managed to perform extremely well, that they were able to get through the cycle. So I think there were some early signs that I'm not sure you could figure out what to do, and I'm not sure that it could have been prevented, although I'd like to really think about that. But I think there were some companies out there that kind of sensed that we were heading into a storm. Nobody projected that it would have the virulent nature that it had, but began to take some protective action.
And you got to remember, the leverage in a lot of these institutions was 30, 40, 45 to 1. Yeah. I mean, so it was magnitude. It was just, you kind of think back at this now and say, how did that ever happen?
Well, as we talk about that, how it happened, you can't help but think that a lot of the CEOs, from Bear Stearns to Lehman Brothers to IndyMac, all said that the hedge funds helped to really light the fire and help push this crisis over the top, and threw gasoline on the fire as it was raging. So you just give us very quick headlines on how important do you think the hedge funds were, and whether they should be reined in some ways to not help this happen again.
A lot of hedge funds out here in the audience here. Better be careful. I've seen it. The hedge funds were big buyers of a lot of paper, and they were involved in a lot of different kinds of transactions. There's no question about that. But I don't think I would pinpoint them as the cause of any of this. I really wouldn't. It was everywhere. And I think a lot of institutions, in hindsight, looking back on it, recognize that they were involved in activities and doing things that weren't really, in the end, right. And I mean, just think of these credit default swaps and the trading of those and what was going on. And these
I don't want to think about
these
them.
things were moving from
You think about them.
from institution to institution. They were moving all around. There's still what's the number? 40-50 trillion dollars of these numbers out there today. It's a huge number, And so you get these anomalies that need to be worked through. And I don't think the hedge funds are the reason to blame for any of this, but they were a party to it. And there is an issue around transparency and oversight that somewhere needs to be looked at, I think, as one goes forward.
Yeah, I wouldn't add much to that. Maybe at the margin they made a really, really, really bad situation, that much worse. But I wouldn't pin it on hedge funds.
The uptick rule and the naked shorting didn't bother you guys too much. Well, how about the other one? You mentioned the rating agencies, and they are also a popular group that gets attacked by congressional leaders and others. How important were they?
I think they were a big factor in this that has not had the same kind of scrutiny.
I agree.
To be fair, because a lot of those debt instruments out there were rated by them, and you have a lot of people blindly following that rating in terms of investing, and so that caused a lot of, you can't blame them for the issue, but they were certainly a party to it in terms of some of the aftermath.
I would say when somebody really smart writes the book, they'll divide it into primary causes, secondary causes, and tertiary. Rating agencies will be in the primary, but right alongside it will be the whole drive for securitization. When Bill at Northern Trust owns a specific asset, he can look at it, he knows exactly what risk he has. When you own a little thin slice of something that's been securitized and parceled out, the risk profile changes dramatically. So you rely more on the rating that the rating agency puts on it. And it's clear to me that, and in fact, you listen to the rating agencies, we didn't mean to imply that a AAA rating on a securitized product was the same as a AAA rating someplace else. Well, where does it say that in the rating? So I would put securitization, I would put in that primary causal factors. Rating agencies are clearly in there. Securitization, the government's support of Fannie and Freddie. In fact, as I said, if you look at the bank TARP program, it seems to me have been wildly successful. That money's being paid back at interest rates and dividends that were appropriate. AIG will pay back much, if not all, of its TARP money. In my judgment, the two that will never get there are Fannie and Freddie, which were awards of the state before this whole thing started. So it will be an interesting and insightful book when someone really breaks it down, as I said, into the primary, secondary, and tertiary causes and starts putting things in and explaining why they're there.
I want to say, TARP is kind of a funny acronym, Troubled Asset Relief Program. And remember, the first effort around that was that there would be a way to take those assets and buy them off. And that program changed to where they decided to put the capital into the institutions. And I know there's even debate on, in Washington now, was that the right thing to do? But the problem is valuation of those assets. Understanding and valuing, they could never get that work through. So there was no buyer because they didn't know how to value what they were buying. In fact, even those assets on the balance sheets today are kind of iffy in terms of their real value. No one really knows what those are.
John, you and I were chatting before also. We tend to use September as a starting point for this great crisis, but it was worse in March of 2009 than it was in September of 2008. So there was an evolution to this whole process, and the range of government responses, I think, reflected that. I think on the third, fourth, fifth day I was at AIG, went in to see the Fed people, and I said, well, why don't you just provide a backup guarantee on all of AIG's stuff? Instead of lending us $80 billion, the credit rating will go back to AAA and I'll go home. And the response was, well, there's no mechanism in the Feds, this is before Treasury and TARP were around, the response was there's no mechanism legally in place for the Federal Reserve to be able to do that. But had they been able to do that, a lot of collateral dollars would have come back into AIG because it then would have been a AAA rated facility. But the reason I bring that up is you forget now when you look back on it that there was a starting point and then there was a deep depression. There's an evolution to the range of solutions that the government applied to this crisis, and they were different in June of 2009 than they were in September of 2008. And I think we know a lot more now about how to do it if the same thing, God forbid, were to occur again.
One final quick question. You talked about life in New York versus Chicago, and we have this unique business leadership community here, and so many of the leaders are here today to be here to enjoy the conversation we've had this evening. Can you just sort of give a headline or two of how New York was different than our Chicago community?
Yeah, there's no city like Chicago. The cohesiveness of the business community and the extent to which the business community and particularly the mayor's office work together, I think is really something. My instincts are, I was only there a year, so you got to accept this for the lack of facts that it represents. It's more anecdotal than anything else. I think the business community is more fractured. There's a lower Manhattan and a middle Manhattan and a Connecticut and a Long Island. I just don't think it has the cohesive nature. We're lucky for whatever reason. I don't know if it's an historical accident. I don't know if it's a great work by the mayor. Maybe it's a great work of all of the people that came before the folks that are on this dais and you all in the room. But Chicago as a business community just seems to me to work a whole lot better.
Well, I'd like you to just, like everyone, to thank Ed and Bill for this wonderful evening. Thank you. Thanks so much. Meeting adjourned.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. It's terrific. It's terrific. Thank you so much.
It was great. No, I don't know what you're better at, Ariel or this. I don't know. Great job, John. You just kept it going. Great questions. It was really good.
Great program. Nice to see you.
You were almost on the stage there for a minute.
Bill gets a weak moment and he calls off my name.
Whenever you're ready, I want to say something to Ed and congratulate him. Ed here. Ed's the only one who's been up with a glass of wine. I said, tell him.